Welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and begin. I see some of you have the laptops, and so you must have gotten the notice we're going to do a little bit of research today. I'll begin with one important announcement, and that is that we have a new classroom starting on Sunday. We're going to be moving upstairs. And actually, I think this new classroom will work a little bit better for us because it's going to have the tables. And since we do a lot of student collaboration during the classes, it'll mean you don't have to move the chairs around quite so much. So I think it'll be an improvement. So Sunday, we're going to be upstairs, EB2 214. Any questions about that? All right. The other important announcement is that next week you've got homework 2 that you need to submit by Tuesday. And I've given you the handout paper for that. If you don't have the physical piece of paper, then it's uploaded onto iLearn, so you can find it there. Just as a reminder, since students can't come into the classroom after the lecture begins, that means that if you happen to come late, you lose the chance to submit the assignment. So one other thing, please staple all the papers together before you come to class. My office hours are before and after this class, and so if you have questions related to the assignment, that's a really good time that you'll always find me in my office. If you want to send me an email, I do my best to respond. I don't check my email constantly, though. I try to avoid becoming a slave to my phone. Otherwise, I just find myself always looking at it in the middle of the night and things, so I force myself to put it aside. So I'll do my best to respond to your emails. And you can also stop by my office outside of office hours. It's just you may not find me there. So any questions related to these announcements? Okay. Actually two of the questions on your homework assignment asks you to identify and label variables in a problem statement. And sometimes word problems are the hardest to solve just because you're trying to interpret the intention of whoever wrote the problem. And so, trying to figure out what is the given and what is the unknown is the hardest part. So that once you've labeled all the variables, actually doing the calculations is maybe negligible. So the 4 main variables that come up in those 2 homework problems are I, which is the symbol we'll use to abbreviate for the interest rate, and the number of periods, and so usually it'll mean the number of years, but sometimes our compounding period will be months. And in that case, it can be a little bit tricky, because if they're telling you that you have to pay every month, but then in the problem statement they describe how many years it has been, then you have to multiply the number of years by 12 in order to get the number of months. So just one word of warning about that trick that comes up. P means a certain amount of money in the present. And so present means at year 0, when whatever transaction happens is just getting started. And again, that can be a little bit of a tricky thing. If you remember the example that we did in class previously where we know what the balance is today, what is the balance 1 year ago? We would actually call that time in the past, we'd call it the present. And I know that seems confusing to you right now, but it's going to be one of those things that's just second nature. We just say P is when things started. It's the 0 year of a transaction. And then F is a certain amount of money in the future. So just for example, if you had a problem statement that says you're borrowing $10,000 at 6% compounded annually, and it should be paid back in 5 years. So how much must be repaid? Now, on those last 2 homework problems, you don't actually need to solve the amount. They're not asking you to do the calculations. They're asking, just break down this problem into labeling the variables. In this one, there's 3 knowns and 1 unknown. All right, so what is I? 6%. P will be the amount that's borrowed initially at year 0 when things are just getting started. So P equals 10,000, and then N is 5. For this one, the clue that N is 5 instead of 60 is where it says compounded annually. We'll get into a lot of details about compounding next week, but it basically just means how often is the bank figuring up the amount of interest that you owe them. So In this case, n equals 5. And so then the unknown, f, is the amount that must be repaid in the future. So we just label, this would be the answer. You know, you'd have the variable and then the quantity. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about this method of using symbols? All right. You know, this class is a lot about engineering economics and applying money for your employer to make good decisions, but I think that it also has the potential to be quite useful to you in a personal sense. You're just getting started with your adult lives, and some of you are accumulating debt in order to be in the university. Hopefully not too much debt, because it can really be a crushing burden. But our society doesn't do a very good job educating people about money before they're earning it and before they're spending it. And there have been a lot of news headlines. UAE debt said to be $95,000 per household. 8 out of 10 UAE residents are in debt. UAE residents sucked into a cycle of debt. I mean, this isn't just a UAE problem, of course. It's a problem all over the world that people find themselves in debt. So why do you think debt is such a common thing? Why do people go into debt? Okay, sometimes that's true. Sometimes debt is the result of mismanagement. Sometimes there's legitimate debt, though, that's reasonable and like a careful decision that seems prudent. So what do you think is good debt and what is bad debt? If we were going to maybe put some qualitative labels on it instead of looking at the calculations, what do you think? Okay. Okay. So you said something really good that I liked. That is, if you have a debt and you use it for an investment. So let's say you have a business and you want to buy a piece of equipment that's going to help your business be more productive. So if you're buying something so that it'll increase your income, that can be a good debt. And so you're doing that if you are going to debt for your education. So if your parents took a loan or if you're taking a loan to pay for tuition, hopefully that tuition means you're going to be able to earn more in the future than you would if you didn't have an education. And so it's an investment. Your debt isn't just for a lavish lifestyle, it's to improve your earning power in the future. And so that could be education, it could be a vehicle, you know, because there's not a lot of employers who provide transportation to the job site. There are some, right? There are some employers that provide transportation to the job site, but usually they don't pay very much, right? They're driving big buses down the freeway, and those positions don't pay as much as the type where the employer says, you just have to get to work here on your own. So what's bad debt? Can you think of something that would be considered, if we said a good debt is something that helps you to increase your earning power, what's a bad debt? Yeah? Pardon me? A failed project? Okay. It could be that maybe it was supposed to be an investment, but it didn't turn out. What's that? If you don't owe it to a bank? So what do you mean? Oh yeah, definitely. So if you're borrowing money from criminal gangs, that's almost certainly a bad debt. Now, like, hold on, I want to talk about that a little more. Who borrows money from criminal gangs? Like in the movies, why is somebody borrowing money from the mafia? What's it usually for? Because the bank says no, right? So what are they going to do with the money when they borrow it from the mafia? Something illegal, right? They're gambling or buying drugs or something. So maybe that's not the best investment if you're borrowing money so that you can bet on a horse at the racetrack, something like that. So that's a bad debt. I agree with you. What are other bad debts? You shouldn't go into debt for what? For things you don't need, right? What if you have only a 32-inch TV and you're embarrassed and so now you feel like you need a 50-inch TV? Is that a good debt? No, I don't think it is. Just scoot a little closer to your TV and it feels like a 50-inch TV, right? Move the couch forward and you save so much money. There's usually a solution like that to anything when it comes to consumer spending. You know, like if you feel like you want to buy more expensive clothes, what it really means probably is you need less expensive friends, you know. So just, I think it's a really good habit to only spend money that you have on things that you want. Don't go into debt for like personal reasons, just for consumer spending, for things like for a meal. You shouldn't borrow money from the bank to eat at a restaurant. And that's really what you're doing when you put money onto a credit card. You're borrowing money from a bank so you can go eat at a restaurant. And you should only be eating the amount of food that you can pay for. I don't want to give you too much advice all at once. So let's go into some terminology. So this is important information that you should be familiar with, and today's activity actually is going to tie into our class project when we get there. I'm going to give you an in-class exercise a little bit later where you're doing some research on looking up interest rates, and you'll use those interest rates when you're doing the project. By the way, I can see that some of you have printed out the notes already, and I'm really glad to see that. This lecture isn't in the notes. This is something that I just put together this morning because there was some extra time between two other subjects. So I'll post the slides for this lecture on iLearn if you want to print them out as well. So let's compare different types of accounts. The first kind of account I want to talk about is a checking account, or sometimes in the UK and other countries it's called a current account. That's where you put your short-term money, and ordinarily a checking account will pay very little, if any, interest. The way that you get money out is with a debit card, using the ATM, a check, or maybe a wire transfer. But really, this is the main place where there's frequent deposits and frequent withdrawals. In the case of a savings account, if we compare the two, a savings account is different because, number one, the whole purpose of it is to accumulate interest. And so these days, savings accounts don't pay a lot of interest, but they nearly always pay more interest than a checking account would. Due to government regulations, there's usually a limit against spending directly from a savings account. You don't normally have a check card or a check itself, the paper checks that would write against a savings account. And the reason for that is that banks want to have as little disruption in their balances as possible, and so they don't want to make it too easy for you to get money out of your savings account because they're using that money to loan it to someone else. You know, the way the bank makes its profit is they only pay you 1% for your savings account, for example, and they take that same money and give it to someone else to buy a house or buy a car, and they charge that someone else more than they're paying you, and they keep the difference. So it's in their interest to have as little movement in your deposits as possible because then they can use that money for other people. So that's the difference between checking and savings. A little bit more obscure, but still fairly common, most banks have both money market and certificate of deposit accounts. A money market account usually pays slightly higher interest rate than a savings account would, and it also gives you the flexibility to sometimes write a limited number of checks against a money market account. The catch is, though, is that usually you have to have a higher balance to open a money market account. It would maybe be 10,000 dirhams or even higher to open a money market account, whereas savings accounts usually don't have those same minimum balance requirements. Now, a certificate of deposit, sometimes it's abbreviated as a CD. In other countries, it's called a time deposit. That's where you make an agreement with the bank that you're going to leave your money in for a fixed amount of time and that you won't withdraw it before the end of the period. The advantage that gives the bank is that the money that they have becomes more stable and it's easier for them to loan it out to someone. Because if suddenly everyone wants their money all at once and the bank has given that money to someone to buy a house for 10 or 15 years, the bank can feel itself in a squeeze where it's hard to give everyone their money back if it's been invested for the long term. So they need to have as much of their money as possible that they're receiving, incoming from other people, on a long-term basis. And so a certificate of deposit allows them to do that, and so as exchange, they'll give you a higher interest rate. for a CD. Now maybe many of you already have a debit card and or a credit card. The difference between the two is that in the case of a debit card, you're spending money you already have, whereas in the case of a credit card, you're borrowing the money. And you promise to pay it back. Some people will pay back the balance on a credit card every month. Sometimes they'll pay back just a small amount, and then that balance keeps continuing for a very long time. This word unsecured means that there isn't a single thing you're promising to the bank that they can take away if you fail to pay that. It's in contrast to a house. When you buy a house, for example, you're pledging to the bank that if you don't pay back, they can take the house. And the same thing is true with a car. A car is a secured loan, meaning that they'll take away your vehicle if you don't pay the balance. But in the case of a credit card where you're buying clothes, meals, televisions, ordinarily it would be very uncommon for a bank to try and repossess your sandwich that you had for lunch or take the clothes that you're wearing. And so that's considered an unsecured loan, where they don't have a physical piece of property they can repossess from you, but of course they still could take you to court and you could go to jail if you don't pay your debts. The other types of loans that I want to talk about today is a mortgage loan, which is home finance, and it's used to purchase real property like homes or lands, and relatively long durations because the cost of homes are usually so high. Here in the Emirates, it seems like a typical repayment time would be a 10-year duration. There are some that are longer. In the U.S., the most common repayment duration is 30 years, although you can get shorter than that and even longer than that as well. The difference between a mortgage loan, which is used to purchase a home, and what's called a home equity loan, is once you have been paying off your house for a certain number of years, you have something called equity. It means maybe your house is worth 500,000 dirhams, and you own 100,000 of that, and the bank owns 400,000 of that. So you own only a portion of your home until the very end, when finally the contract is ripped up and you own it outright. So before it's paid off completely, you can take a loan against the balance that's actually yours. They call that your equity. And so some people will spend the equity in their house to do things like pay off medical bills or to make improvements to the house or to send their children to college. So that's a home equity loan. All right, so what we're going to do today is I'd like you to get a feeling for some of these rates. So hopefully you've got a phone that can do research, and I'd suggest that you maybe collaborate with another student as you do this. I'm going to ask you to think of 3 banks, and if there's no shortage of banks in the UAE. There are dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of banks. So think of 3 banks, go online, and I'm going to ask you to look up the savings account rate, the finance rates for automobiles, and the finance rates for homes. And we're going to find out how much do they charge for these things. And then we're going to compare and sort of talk about why the rates are different for one thing versus another. All right, so get in groups of 2 or 3. Do your research. You may end up at a dead end. So if you're going through the list and you find, you wanted to start with, let's say, HSBC and you can't find it on their website, just go to a different bank. All right? So this is kind of difficult because every bank has their website unique from the other one. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of searching to find what you're looking for. So for example, Emirates NBD, they're saying that they offer an interest rate of 0.25% PA. Anybody know what PA means? Pascal, exactly. When we're in fluid mechanics, when we're in cost analysis, it means something else. Per annum, right, it means per year. So 0.25% per year. That's not a lot of money. I mean, essentially what that means is if you deposit 1,000 dirhams, then at the end of the year, they're going to give you 2.5 dirhams as a reward for leaving your money with them all year long. That's not a lot, right? That's just enough to buy a couple of bottles of water. And you gave them 1,000 dirhams for a whole year. All right? So let's see, what was their auto loan? Okay, for the auto loan, the first thing that I noticed is that they are paying less to you when you deposit your money than they are charging people when they borrow money from the bank. So this is saying to buy a car, the lowest rate they've got is 2.75% PA per annum. Some of you noticed that when you were going to a website for a car, it wanted to know like how much the car cost and what are some other variables that also affect the savings account rates versus the auto loan rates. All right, so when you're looking on savings accounts, even at one bank, they sometimes had different rates they were paying. What were some of the factors that the variable rates depended on? How much you put in. Of course, there's also the number of years, but that's a fixed deposit account. That's not strictly speaking a savings account. But it is true that if you leave it in longer, if you promise to leave it for a certain time, then they'll pay your higher interest. But the amount you're saving, do they give you more or less for saving a greater amount? More. Yeah, more. What they're doing is they're trying to attract large deposits that will stay there as long as possible. The auto loan rates, those vary depending on the longer you're borrowing it, the interest rate goes up. And sometimes whether it's a new car versus a used car also affects the loan rate. They charge a higher interest rate usually if you're buying a used car instead of a new car. Has anybody got to the home loan rates yet? What were some, like for the UAE-based banks, what were some of the home rates that you found, the percentages? 1.6? 1.3? 1.63 for a home loan? Wow, that's very low. I'm surprised. What were some of the others? 2.9. What's the highest? Anybody find something over 3? 5.4? What bank was that? What bank was doing 5.4? Which one? Okay. So why do you think some banks are charging more than others for a mortgage? Yeah? Okay, so the variables, the longer you're borrowing the money, usually you have to pay a higher interest rate because it's riskier for the bank. There's the risk that the money in the future won't be worth as much, and there's also the risk that someone won't repay. And so a longer duration usually means it's a higher interest rate. And so we can see that same effect if we go to bank rate. The first thing that comes up over here in the upper right is going to be interest rates. The internet's very slow in here. I think it's probably because we're all on our phones. All right. So over here, it's showing the rates for a 30-year, we were just on it, mortgage. All right, a 30-year versus a 15-year. This is sort of like the typical rates. If you borrow money for 30 years, you pay 3.71%. If you borrow for 15, 2.84. the main factors there is just the risk to the bank. It's the risk that they won't be getting back the value that they gave you over time because of inflation. And the longer amount of time you have to pay back, the greater the risk is to the bank. So they charge a higher interest rate to sort of cover their bases so that they don't have as much pressure. Let's look at credit cards. That's one important thing I want to point out. You may not have got to credit cards yet, but that's where a lot of people get into trouble, is with credit cards. So we're going to look at no annual fee cards, just to make it simple. How much do you think the interest rate is going to be on credit cards? 6 or 7%? I mean, if we're looking at houses and cars, everything's been in the single digits so far, right? Let's look at interest rates for credit cards, just using this one as the first example. 13 to 23%. That's huge, especially with compounding. What you won't realize until a little bit later when we start doing these calculations is that there's a nonlinear effect because of the way that interest compounds. So a 10% loan and a 20% loan, it's not like you're just paying twice as much with a 20% loan. You're paying really, really a lot more because the interest accumulates and compounds, and you're paying interest on the interest that accumulates. And so credit cards are really, really dangerous. It's like kryptonite. You're dealing with something that's really dangerous. 13 to 23%, the amount of money that you owe to the bank will just explode when you purchase things on a credit card. And it's not just this bank. If you go through here, all of the banks have these same really high rates, 18 to 23. Sometimes they're even above 30% interest. I don't see any on this list that's above 30%, but you really have to be careful with credit cards because the costs can accumulate really quickly. So let's go back to our original discussion of when to borrow money and when to be cautious about borrowing money. So what about for a graduate school? Some of you may find yourself in the case of going to graduate school. Like, what's the rational decision about whether to go into debt for a graduate school? How do you know whether or not you should do it? Right. Whether it'll significantly increase your salary or not. There's been a trend to having more and more people go to college, but there's a lot of good-paying jobs, in the trades that don't require college degrees. And so people like welders, really highly skilled welders in technical fields that are working on offshore oil platforms can make a good salary, sometimes even higher than a college graduate. And so not all jobs that pay well require a college education, but there is definitely a trend that the more education you have, the higher your earning power is. So what I'd like you to do is hold on to this for the class period when we are going to start looking at the project. Because in the project, what I ask you to do is start looking at some factors that's going to determine your finances through your whole life. Oh, these horrible markers. Okay, the first is going to be the income. The second is expenses. And so you can think of your wallet as a tank. How many people in here have already taken fluid mechanics? All right, most people. You remember the Reynolds transport theorem? The difference between in and out, right? In versus out. Okay, if this is your wallet, meaning if this is your savings, what do you want to happen inside of the control volume? You want in to be more than out. Exactly. Why? You want your savings to accumulate, right? What happens if out is bigger than in? That your savings is going down, and you can even go negative. Negative savings is debt, right? And debt's that dangerous thing where basically the bank owns you when you have too much debt. You can't quit your job. You have to do whatever the bank says so you can pay the bank. So in this project, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to think about, once you graduate, what kind of a job are you going to have? Talk to some people you know who've graduated recently, try and find information online, and estimate what is your income going to be once you've graduated. And then I'd like you to think rationally about what could be your expenses. And so maybe you've never gone grocery shopping before where you actually had to pay the bill at the end. But think about, if you're going to eat food for a week, what would be your expenses there? What would be your fuel costs, your housing costs? And so, over the course of an entire year, estimate your expenses. And then savings is the income minus the expenses. So then what do you do with your savings is you have to put it somewhere, right? You want to make your money work for you. And so we're going to talk partly about, you could put some of your money into banks, but there are other investments as well, like stocks and bonds, mutual funds. And so every once in a while, when we've got some spare time at the end of class, I'm going to introduce you to a new financial instrument that you can incorporate into the project. And so you can start thinking about, like, your adult life, that you're just on the verge of starting to make some serious money. Are you going to make sure that your in is greater than your out, so that at the end of your career you have enough to live on? And that's what you want, right, is to have a really comfortable retirement where you're floating in your yacht and flying off for vacations everywhere. So, all right, let's take one last look at these announcements before you finish for the day. Remember, we're going to be in our new classroom on Sunday, so don't come here. This will be the wrong spot. We're going to be upstairs in room 214. I'll see you then.